The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, is best known as a cornerstone of early modern demonology and witch-hunting ideology. Its legacy owes much to its legal and theological arguments justifying the persecution of witches as a diabolical sect of heretics. However, this infamous text also preserves something less obvious, but historically valuable: a sustained engagement with contemporary debates about astrology and astral causality from the viewpoint of a university-educated Dominican friar and inquisitor. In particular, Part 1, Question 5 addresses the question whether witchcraft can be attributed to the influence of celestial bodies. While Kramer, aka Henricus Institutor, ultimately rejects any theory that ascribes moral or spiritual causality to the stars, the care with which he lays out his arguments against astral determinism shows us just how prominent astrological thought was in the late 15th century. The Malleus Maleficarum, despite its blood-soaked history and its virulently polemical tone, offers historians a unique view into the intellectual boundaries of astrology in the late medieval and early modern periods. Its rejection of astral determinism is not a wholesale dismissal of astrology, but a theologically motivated effort to delineate which aspects of celestial theory could be assimilated into Catholic orthodoxy and which could not. In doing so, the author shows how the language of natural philosophy, demonic agency, and moral responsibility converged around the question of astral influence in the period immediately preceding the Burning Times. The central concern of Part 1, Question 5 is articulated as follows: is it in any way a Catholic opinion to hold that the origin and growth of witchcraft proceed from the influence of the celestial bodies? What comes after is not a brief dismissal, but a detailed account of various theories of astral causation, many of which were widely accepted in both learned and popular contexts. Kramer begins by noting the appeal of attributing sin, including the sin of witchcraft, to the wickedness of human nature itself. This, of course, aligns with St. Augustine's teaching that sin arises from free will. Kramer paraphrases him as such: "The cause of a man's depravity lies in his own will, whether he sins at his own or at another's suggestion. The devil cannot destroy free will, for this would militate against liberty." This Augustinian framework, enshrining the indomitable nature of the will, establishes the theological backdrop against which astral explanations are weighed. Kramer then turns to what is evidently a well-known position, that the stars can influence or even determine human behavior. He writes, "If the stars were not the cause of human actions, both good and bad, astrologers would not so frequently foretell the truth about the results of wars and other human acts. Therefore, they are in some way a cause." In other words, the fact that astrology has some predictive power seems to support the idea that celestial bodies exert causal force over human events. Kramer extends this argument by noting that demonic activity itself appears to follow celestial rhythms. For example, he says that lunatics are more afflicted by demons during certain lunar phases, and that necromancers, practitioners of nigromancia, spiritual or demonic magic, perform rituals at astrologically opportune moments. Quote, "Certain men who are called lunatics are molested by devils more at one time than at another. Necromancers observe certain constellations for the invoking of devils, which they would not do unless they knew that those devils were subject to the stars." Now, say what you will about Kramer's view of astral spirits and intelligences being devils, what's notable here is how he reveals that astrology was not a marginal belief, but a natural philosophical framework capable of explaining not just natural or political events, but even the activity of demons. The specific reference to necromancers observing constellations reflects a technical magical practice, a learned ritual tradition derived from Arabic and Latin sources like Pseudo-Alkindi's On Stellar Rays and the Picatrix, which involve planetary hours, astrological elections, and the drawing down of spirits into talismanic images. In Kramer's reading, these rituals don't succeed because of the stars themselves, but because demons act in ways designed to appear naturalistic, thereby deceiving both practitioner and victim. Now, the theological problem posed by astral determinism is made clear in Kramer's response. To assert that the stars necessarily cause human behavior is to undermine the core doctrines of sin, merit, and grace. As Kramer puts it, he who argues that everything of necessity proceeds from the stars takes away all merit and, in consequence, all blame. Also, he takes away grace and therefore glory. Astral determinism, then, is not just an error, it's a heresy, because it eliminates human accountability and makes divine judgment unintelligible. Really, anything that undermines any aspect of the penitential cycle administered by the Church is heresy, and that, of course, is the very thing that all Dominican inquisitors are sworn to root out and destroy. It's the reason St. Dominic founded the order in the first place. Now, despite all this, the Malleus does not condemn astrology in all its forms. Instead, its author articulates a classic distinction drawn from earlier scholastic sources between necessary and contingent forms of astral influence. There are two ways, Kramer says, in which it can be understood that men's characters can be caused by the stars, either completely and of necessity, or by disposition and contingency. The first is false and heretical, but the second, the idea that celestial bodies can incline human temperaments, is acceptable and perfectly natural, provided it doesn't eliminate the possibility of free will. This distinction draws on Galenic humoral theory and Aristotelian natural philosophy, as practiced throughout the universities of the High and Late Middle Ages. Kramer explains that the stars may affect the humors, and the humors, in turn, shape personality. The choleric are wrathful, the sanguine are kindly, the melancholy are envious, and the phlegmatic are slothful. But this is not absolute, for the soul is master of its body, especially when it is helped by grace. In this formulation, astrology is given a place within the grand order of natural causes, but only as a remote influence on the body. For the Dominican, it is the rational soul, not the stars, that govern moral action, including whether or not a person chooses to engage in witchcraft. To illustrate the point, Kramer cites an anecdote from Augustine's City of God, in which two twin brothers fall ill and recover simultaneously. An astrologer explains the coincidence by reference to their identical horoscopes. A physician attributes it to their shared humoral makeup. Kramer sides with the physician. The physician's answer was better, since he adduced the more powerful and immediate cause. This example reinforces the hierarchy of causes that governs this section of the Malleus. Astrology may be useful in explaining broad patterns in bodily disposition, but it cannot account for individual moral behavior, which depends on free will and grace. Now, the question of astral causality also touches on the interpretation of celestial portents. The author turns to the topic of comets, which were long considered harbingers of disaster, especially the deaths of kings. Kramer presents two views. First, he quotes John of Damascus, who held that comets are temporary signs created by God for specific occasions. Quote, "Comets are not of the stars which were created in the beginning, but are made for a particular occasion and then dissolved by divine command." According to this view, comets are not part of the natural order, but inserted by divine will as signs. The second view, attributed to unnamed philosophers, is that comets are natural phenomena, vapors ignited in the upper air. This model explains the association between comets and death not through fate, but through physiology. Because the rich tend to consume hot and dry foods, and comets are hot and dry in nature, their appearance correlates with outbreaks of illness that disproportionately affect the wealthy. Now, Kramer doesn't take sides in this debate. Instead, he uses both models to underscore his main point. Whatever the mechanism, comets do not cause events like the death of a king. They may signal divine intention or indicate changing environmental conditions, but they do not compel human fate. Kramer writes, "From this we see that the stars have no influence over free will, or, consequently, over the malice and character of men." In Part 2, Chapter 5, the discussion of celestial influence resumes, now in the context of what demons can and cannot do. Kramer describes 6 kinds of harm that witches, acting in concert with demons, can inflict on human beings: seducing them into illicit love, stirring up hatred, causing impotence or full-on phallus removal, inducing illness, taking life, and depriving the mind of reason. These are not imaginary effects. The Malleus treats them as real and serious, but it insists that such harms do not come from the stars. Quote, "Saving the influence of the stars, the devils can by their natural power in every way cause real defects and infirmities by their natural spiritual power, which is superior to any bodily power. However, even demons have their limits. The author argues that devils cannot alter the stars, and he offers 3 reasons. 1. The stars are physically located above the sphere where demons operate, that is, in the circle of air. 2. The stars are governed by good angels. And 3. The structure of the universe would be compromised if demons could alter celestial movements." Kramer writes, "Those changes which were miraculously caused in the Old and New Testament were done by God through the good angels. But in all other matters, with God's permission, the devils can work their spells." So here, for our Inquisitor, demonic agency is real, but it's bounded. Devils cannot interfere with celestial order. They can only mimic or exploit it. If they choose to attack during a full moon or under certain planetary alignments, it's to create the illusion that the stars are responsible, a kind of grand deception, as you'd expect from the hosts of the Lord of Lies. This misdirection, then, leads people to trust in astrology rather than God, and to mistake sin for fate. At stake in all this is more than an abstract metaphysical dispute. For Kramer and his fellow inquisitors, the real danger of astrology, especially in its deterministic forms, is that it undermines the sacramental economy of salvation. If sin is caused by the stars, then confession is unnecessary, penance is meaningless, and divine justice collapses. As guardians of that system, Dominicans were bound not only to suppress heresy, but to preserve the integrity of moral causality itself. To clarify his position, Kramer outlines a threefold division of causes that govern human beings. 3 things are to be considered in man which are directed by 3 celestial causes, namely, the act of the will, the act of the intellect, and the act of the body. The first is governed directly and solely by God, the second by an angel, and the third by a celestial body. This hierarchy places the stars at the bottom of the causal chain, governing only the body. The intellect is influenced by angels, and the will, where moral decisions are made, is ruled directly by God. This tripartite model mirrors the standard Ptolemaic cosmology widely accepted in late medieval thought, in which concentric celestial spheres are moved by separate angelic intelligences, at the very summit of which is the empyrean heaven of God and his higher angels. Any attempt to invert this order, or to treat the stars as the highest power in human affairs amounts to idolatry. The author even links this belief to the ancient goddess Fortune, who, quote, mocks human affairs in a haphazard and fortuitous manner. Conclusion. The Malleus Maleficarum is by no means a treatise on astrology, but as a demonological manual, it offers a remarkably detailed account of how astrology was thought to work by a late medieval Dominican inquisitor, and not surprisingly, Kramer's ideas are not far off from what we find in other polemical works against astrology from the same time period. I'm thinking chiefly here about Savonarola's account in The Triumph of the Cross, though in both cases the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas looms large. In their effort to defend free will, moral responsibility, and divine justice, members of the Dominican order confronted a range of astrological beliefs, some widely accepted, others clearly heterodox. They distinguished between acceptable theories of natural inclination and heretical doctrines of astral necessity. They acknowledged that astrologers frequently predict events correctly, that necromancers use the stars, and that the movement of celestial bodies has real effects on bodies and temperaments, but they drew a clear line. The stars may incline, but they do not compel. They allowed for celestial influence to affect the body, but not the soul. They allowed astrology to serve natural philosophy, but not to explain sin or salvation. In the end, the real enemy in this is not the stars, but the idea that they can relieve us of responsibility for our choices. No planet or constellation can make a witch. Only the will, corrupted by sin and tempted by the devil, can do that. This careful boundary drawing reveals a great deal about the place of astrology in late medieval thought. Kramer is not rejecting astrology altogether. He is, rather, policing its boundaries, accepting its place in natural philosophy, but denying its relevance to the moral and spiritual life. This balancing act reflects a broader effort, typical of the 15th century, to reconcile the inheritance of Greco-Arabic science with Christian theology. And in trying to do so, the Malleus becomes a valuable historical source, not just for witch hunting, but for the intellectual history of astrology at the end of the Middle Ages as well. If you'd like to support more work such as this, please visit patreon.com/themodernhermeticist, and above all, thank you for listening.